In the rugged, windswept hills of Montana, far from the nearest town and the reach of ordinary oversight, a small mining operation clung to life amid the rocky slopes. The year was 1921, a time when the echoes of the First World War still haunted communities, and the restless promise of mineral wealth drew men to dangerous, isolated places. It was here, in these shadowed mines, that a mystery began to unfold, one that would defy explanation and linger in the collective memory of those who lived nearby. The miners themselves were ordinary men in appearance, their faces lined by labor and weather, hands calloused and stained by the constant toil of extracting ore from unforgiving rock. Yet their lives were not ordinary in circumstance. Day after day, they descended into the tunnels, lanterns swinging and pickaxes striking, aware that a single misstep could mean injury or death. The mountain seemed to watch them as much as they worked it, a silent observer of sweat, perseverance, and quiet conversations whispered under the hum of lamps. But on one particular morning, the rhythm of their lives would be broken. It began with absence. A single miner failed to return from his early shift, prompting casual concern at first. Another went missing during the afternoon, leaving behind only a half-eaten lunch and an abandoned lantern. By evening, the mine seemed to have swallowed them whole. Family members, co-workers, and neighbors felt the weight of an intangible dread pressing down from the mountainside. The usual creaking of the timber supports and the dull echo of picks against stone became ominous, a soundtrack to the unfolding enigma. Locals spoke cautiously of strange lights seen flickering within the mine, odd noises that could not be attributed to the shifting rock or the wind whistling through the entrance. Some claimed to hear whispers, men's voices calling for help, yet never answering each other, echoing down passages that led nowhere. There was no visible sign of struggle, no evidence of collapse, yet the miners were gone, leaving an emptiness as profound as the darkness that had claimed them. Stories began to circulate in the surrounding towns, carried by miners who had left the mountains, by merchants who had traded with families, and by pastors who had counseled the anxious relatives. Each retelling emphasized the inexplicable nature of the event, the chilling reality that men could vanish without a trace in a place so well traveled by laborers. The first search parties faced both physical and psychological challenges. Lanterns flickered in the thin air, beams cutting through dust and shadow as they navigated tunnels that seemed to shift in perception. The miners' voices were occasionally heard, shouts that seemed to echo from every direction at once. But when responders moved toward the sound, there was nothing. Tools lay scattered as if left mid-task, yet no bodies appeared, no signs of passage beyond the last known footprints. Each hour deepened the sense of unease, and by nightfall, the mountain seemed to pulse with an almost sentient awareness, as though it were deliberately holding its secrets close. Observers noted that the miners' absence carried a heavier weight than simple disappearance. Families were haunted not only by worry, but by visions conjured in the periphery of daily life. A shadow moving past the cabin at dusk, a flicker of lantern light in the distance, the subtle clatter of a pickaxe striking in the quiet of dawn. Some dismissed these as grief-induced illusions. Others felt certain that the mountain itself had become a repository for the missing, preserving them in a state of liminal existence, neither alive nor gone. The psychological strain on the community became palpable, with anxiety spreading like fog, settling in homes, shops, and schools. Rumors naturally began to intertwine with fact. Some spoke of secret tunnels leading into the depths, passages the miners themselves may have discovered, now concealing those who vanished. Others whispered of a supernatural presence, a guardian of the veins of ore that demanded tribute. Even practical-minded townsfolk found it impossible to dismiss entirely the combination of unexplained absence, eerie sounds, and shifting shadows. Each account, whether skeptical or credulous, added to a tapestry of collective unease, a sense that the mountains were holding a dark, unyielding secret. The miners' families, silent witnesses to the disappearance, navigated grief compounded by uncertainty. The women who waited at home, the children who played near the mine entrance, all carried the invisible weight of missing men whose return was uncertain. Each morning brought renewed hope and new dread, as neighbors offered assistance and clergy provided counsel. Yet the disappearance seemed to mock all attempts at comprehension. The miners' presence lingered in the community's consciousness, a ghostly reminder of how quickly ordinary life could dissolve into mystery. In the days that followed, investigators attempted to map the mine with precision, measuring angles, assessing structural integrity, and comparing the terrain against labor records. Nothing could account for the absence. No collapse had occurred. No water had swept through the tunnels. No evidence suggested foul play beyond the realm of imagination. The absence itself became the focal point, a profound, unexplainable silence within the earth. Even the simplest routines, such as fetching water or tending livestock near the mine, were colored by anxiety, as if the surrounding environment now held a latent threat. As night fell over the mountains, the full weight of the story began to settle. Lanterns glimmered in cabins, the wind moaned through distant peaks, and the mine entrance stood silent and impenetrable. Those who had ventured near reported a peculiar sensation, a quiet oppression that pressed upon the chest and made breath shallow. The darkness was alive with potential movement, yet utterly still. In that moment, the world of the living intersected with the unknown, leaving the community and anyone who dared contemplate the event with a lingering unease, the sense that something essential had been taken and might never be returned. Thus begins the story of the miners who vanished in the dark, a narrative of ordinary men drawn into extraordinary circumstance, of families and communities left to wrestle with the unknowable, and of a Montana landscape that, in its isolation and grandeur, concealed a mystery no practical explanation could wholly unravel. From this beginning, we will explore the social, cultural, and historical context of early 20th century Montana, the sequence of strange events in the mines, the reactions of those who bore witness, and the chilling climax that cemented the tale in memory. And finally, we will consider the lingering questions, the echo of absence, and the reflective mystery that persists in the shadowed tunnels and the minds of those who remember. Montana in the early 20th century was a land of extremes, both in climate and opportunity. The vast plains gave way to jagged mountain ranges, rich in minerals and natural resources, drawing laborers from across the country in search of work and fortune. The state had only recently emerged from the frontier period, and its communities were scattered, small and tightly knit, bound together by shared hardships and mutual dependence. Towns were few and far between, and the physical isolation of the mining regions fostered a distinctive social dynamic, one defined by resilience, self-reliance, and a cautious wariness of outsiders. Life in these mining communities was governed by the rhythm of labor and survival. Men spent long hours underground, digging through rock and shale to extract veins of coal, copper, silver, and gold. Mines were physically dangerous and socially demanding. Accidents were frequent, injuries common, and fatalities a persistent reality. Laborers relied on experience, instinct, and close coordination with their peers to navigate these hazards. Mining was not merely work. It was a test of endurance, skill, and psychological fortitude. Each descent into the shaft required trust in both equipment and companions, and a single lapse could be catastrophic. The culture surrounding these mining operations was shaped by both necessity and tradition. Miners developed a unique lexicon, signaling with taps, whistles, and lantern movements to communicate through the labyrinthine passages where sound was distorted and darkness ruled. Informal hierarchies emerged, often based on skill, experience, or perceived reliability. Within these subterranean societies, trust was both earned and fragile. Reputation could determine one's role, responsibility, or even survival. The shared experience of danger created strong bonds, yet it also amplified suspicion, particularly when unexplainable events disrupted routine or threatened. Cohesion. Montana's social environment in 1921 was heavily influenced by the aftermath of World War I. Veterans returned to communities still recovering from economic and social upheaval. The influx of workers seeking employment in mining towns intensified competition and heightened tensions. Social norms were both rigid and evolving. Traditional notions of masculinity, labor, and family responsibility coexisted with a developing awareness of modern industry and organizational efficiency. Isolated communities were sensitive to anomalies. Deviations from expected behavior were scrutinized, often interpreted as moral failing, supernatural influence, or practical threat. In terms of infrastructure, the mines themselves were a study in precarious engineering. Timber supports held tunnels against the constant pressure of shifting rock. Rudimentary ventilation systems struggled to deliver fresh air to deeper shafts. and rudimentary lighting provided only limited illumination, leaving shadows that played tricks on the mind. The conditions were unforgiving. Workers faced not only the inherent dangers of excavation, but also the psychological strain imposed by darkness, confinement, and the constant threat of collapse. Each tunnel was a microcosm of tension, with every sound amplified, every movement deliberate, and every misstep potentially fatal. The economic context cannot be overstated. Mining was one of the few sources of stable employment in remote Montana, and families depended heavily on the income of those who descended daily into the shafts. Wages were modest, but survival often depended on the ability to navigate both labor and danger effectively. This economic pressure contributed to a culture of endurance and quiet heroism, as miners took calculated risks to provide for those they left behind. The stakes of disappearance, accident, or failure were not abstract. They carried real consequences for household survival, community cohesion, and social reputation. Montana's mining communities were also shaped by ethnic and cultural diversity. Immigrants from Europe, particularly from eastern and southern regions, brought distinct customs, languages, and techniques, creating a mosaic of practices and beliefs within the mines. These cultural differences sometimes led to friction, but also to innovation, as miners exchanged knowledge of geological formations, extraction methods, and survival strategies. Folklore and superstition were pervasive, and the interpretation of accidents, unexplained sounds, or vanishings often drew on a mix of cultural mythologies. Ghost stories, tales of spirits guarding mineral veins, and warnings of restless entities beneath the earth were as much part of daily conversation as practical safety procedures. The physical environment of Montana contributed further to the psychological landscape. Winters were harsh, summers brief and intense, and sudden storms were a constant threat to both life and work. The mountains themselves, with jagged cliffs, hidden ravines, and labyrinthine tunnels, fostered both awe and apprehension. Workers developed an intimate knowledge of these landscapes, yet the unpredictable nature of rock falls, flooding, and cave-ins ensured that no one ever felt entirely secure. The environment reinforced a culture of vigilance, preparedness, and quiet observation, where awareness of every detail could mean the difference between life and death. Community institutions, such as churches, local newspapers, and social clubs played an important role in shaping perception and memory. Clergy provided moral guidance and mediated social disputes, often emphasizing endurance, faith, and the proper conduct of laborers and families. Newspapers chronicled accidents, disappearances, and mining developments, shaping public understanding with a blend of fact and narrative interpretation. These channels not only informed but also amplified the sense of unease, especially when reports were incomplete, contradictory, or sensationalized. In this way, collective memory and rumor intertwined, creating fertile ground for enduring legends. Scientific understanding at the time was limited. Occupational hazards such as gas buildup, structural failure, and mental strain were recognized, but investigative tools were rudimentary. Exploration of mines depended on lantern light and human instinct, and the psychological impact of prolonged darkness, isolation, and stress was only beginning to be studied. Physicians noted the effects of fatigue, poor ventilation, and overexertion on miners' physical and mental health, but many phenomena, such as disappearance or inexplicable accidents, remained beyond the reach of contemporary science. Folklore, superstition, and rumor often filled these gaps, providing explanations that blended the natural and supernatural. The social and historical backdrop of Montana mining life in 1921 is essential to understanding the events that followed. Communities were tightly knit yet isolated. Labor was dangerous and relentless, and the environment amplified every risk. Miners were both ordinary and extraordinary, ordinary in their humble beginnings and daily routines, extraordinary in their capacity for endurance and psychological resilience. Into this world of shadows, risk, and cultural complexity entered the mystery that would define the narrative: the miners who vanished in the dark. In this context, the story is not simply about disappearance, but about human interaction with environment, culture, and technology under extreme conditions. It explores the psychological strain of isolation, the role of communal memory in shaping perception, and the tension between rational explanation and the unknown. By situating the events within this broader historical, cultural, and social framework, we gain insight into the conditions that allowed such a mystery to occur, why it haunted the community, and how it continues to fascinate those who study dark history today. The first sign that something was profoundly wrong came quietly, almost imperceptibly. A miner, ordinarily punctual and meticulous, failed to emerge at the end of his shift. The next morning, lanterns were lowered into the shafts, yet the beams illuminated only dust, rock, and abandoned tools. It was as if the mine itself had absorbed the presence of the men, leaving behind only traces of labor, shattered pick handles, overturned buckets, and faint impressions in the soil. The families waiting near the entrance could sense an unnatural stillness, broken only by the distant, hollow echo of dripping water. The following day brought further confusion. Another miner disappeared mid-shift, leaving behind a partially dismantled timber support and a mining cart toppled onto its side. Co-workers entered the tunnels cautiously, voices low, hearts pounding, as they traced the sounds of movement that never corresponded to anything tangible. Footsteps echoed from every direction, yet when they advanced toward the noise, there was nothing but the hollow expanse of rock. Lantern light flickered on walls that seemed to breathe in the shadows, and every creak or groan of timber was amplified into a sound of imminent collapse. By the third day, concern had turned to fear. A small party ventured deeper into the mine than usual, following the mapped shafts with lanterns and rope lines. They discovered marks on the rock, scratchings that suggested frantic motion, and at intervals, a lantern left on the floor as if abandoned mid-task. The workers who found it instinctively recoiled, sensing that the object had been left by someone who might return, or might have vanished entirely. Outside, families reported strange phenomena, tools appearing in unusual locations, faint murmurs from within the mine, and shadows cast across the hills that did not correspond to any known object. The psychological strain intensified when an explosion occurred in a lower tunnel. It was minor, a sudden burst of trapped gas igniting with a dull roar, yet it left a menacing aftermath. Splintered wood, jagged rock, and a cloud of dust that lingered in the air, making every movement uncertain. The miners on duty were momentarily blinded, coughing and stumbling, and when they regained orientation, one of their number was missing. There was no evidence of injury, no body, only the terrifying impression that the darkness itself had claimed him. Those present described the moment as surreal, a quiet horror that exceeded panic because the threat was invisible and pervasive. Further incidents followed in rapid succession. A rope snapped while hauling ore from a deeper shaft, narrowly avoiding a fatal fall but leaving one miner unconscious on a ledge, while another vanished from view, leaving behind only a boot. Lanterns swayed from the ceiling, casting erratic shadows that seemed to move independently. The men called out for each other, their voices bouncing along tunnels in ways that made it impossible to identify direction. Echoes mingled with the natural groaning of the mine, creating auditory illusions that disoriented even the most experienced workers. Each event intensified the sense of unreality. Every familiar routine became fraught with latent threat, and every shadow held potential disappearance. At one point, a miner accidentally struck a support beam with a pickaxe. The resulting vibration caused small rocks to cascade onto the floor, yet the sound seemed magnified, echoing as though the mountain itself were responding. In that instant, the miner felt a chilling presence behind him, but when he turned, there was nothing. The absence of tangible threat magnified fear, transforming ordinary hazards into something almost sentient. Co-workers, witnessing the man's reaction, felt an involuntary shiver, understanding that the mine was no longer a mere workplace, but a space where perception, danger, and imagination converged. An even more dramatic incident occurred when a sudden collapse blocked the main passage temporarily. Miners were trapped in a side tunnel, their lanterns sputtering, air thick with dust, and every sound exaggerated into menace. One attempted to climb a shaft to escape, only to hear the faintest cry behind him, a voice calling his name, distorted and distant. He froze, gripping the timber, and when he looked, no one was there. By the time the obstruction was cleared, one member of the group had vanished without trace, leaving the remaining miners in stunned silence. The incident sparked debates on whether psychological stress, hypoxia, or some inexplicable force was responsible, yet no explanation satisfied all observers. Outside the mine, Families and neighbors reacted to these escalating events with a mixture of concern and superstition. Objects disappeared and reappeared, tools moved inexplicably, and the natural sounds of the mountain, rocks shifting, wind through crevices, took on an almost deliberate tone. Dogs refused to enter the vicinity, and livestock became unusually skittish. Local newspapers began reporting unexplained disturbances at the mine, emphasizing disappearances and strange phenomena, which further amplified tension and attracted outsiders seeking to witness the mystery firsthand. The pattern of incidents persisted over weeks. Miners would enter the tunnels and fail to return, returning occasionally in a dazed or silent state, unable to account for missing hours. Lanterns would go dark inexplicably. Tools would vanish. Walls seemed to shift subtly, disorienting even those with detailed maps. Attempts at systematic exploration failed to reconcile the evidence. Each incident reinforced the sense of the mine as a living, responsive entity, one that operated by rules opaque to the human mind. In several cases, accidents that should have resulted in immediate injury produced no corporeal harm, deepening the psychological unease. A miner fell several feet into a water-filled shaft, yet emerged unscathed, soaked and shivering but otherwise intact. Another was nearly struck by a collapsing beam, only for it to wedge itself against a wall without causing damage. Observers interpreted these near misses as both miraculous and unnerving, reinforcing the notion that the mine operated under unknown principles. The boundary between physical law and psychological perception became blurred, contributing to a pervasive atmosphere of suspense and dread. Attempts to leave the mine unattended only heightened anxiety. Lanterns left in shafts were found moved, sometimes miles from their original placement. Footprints appeared where no one had walked. Whispers echoed through silent tunnels, faint yet distinct, calling out names or issuing warnings that could not be ignored. The cumulative effect was a state of constant tension. Miners became hyper-aware, their senses sharpened. Yet this heightened alertness contributed to exhaustion and misperception, creating a feedback loop of fear and caution. As days turned into weeks, the pattern of disappearance and near accidents became the defining characteristic of the mining operation. Lanterns swinging in the dark seemed almost animate. Shadows danced along the walls. Whispers persisted in the periphery of hearing. Families, neighbors, and visiting investigators documented these events meticulously, yet no account fully explained the phenomena. Each incident added a layer of complexity, uncertainty, and silent terror, transforming the mine from a place of labor into a locus of mystery, fear, and legend. By the end of the month, the mine had become synonymous with vanishing, disorientation, and unexplained events. The cumulative effect of accidents, disappearances, and auditory illusions created a psychological landscape as treacherous as the tunnels themselves. The miners who remained adapted cautiously, learning to navigate not only physical obstacles but the subtle, inexplicable pressures of a space that seemed to respond to thought, movement, and emotion. Survival was no longer only a matter of skill. It became a matter of intuition, perception, and endurance under relentless uncertainty. The incidents continued to resonate beyond the tunnels. Families at home spoke of sudden chills, inexplicable noises, and fleeting glimpses of movement near abandoned equipment. Townsfolk debated rational explanations, invoking gas buildup, hallucination, or fatigue, yet even the most practical interpretations failed to account for the full scope of occurrences. The mine, in effect, had become a theater of both physical danger and psychological suspense, where the ordinary was transformed into the extraordinary, and every shadow carried a whisper of the vanished. The disappearances in the Montana mines did not remain confined to the tunnels. They rippled outward, touching every corner of the small, tight-knit communities nearby. Families were the first to experience the weight of absence, not just the practical void left by missing laborers, but the psychological tension that settled in homes like an uninvited shadow. Mothers sat quietly at windowsills, staring down paths where footsteps might appear. Wives paused in daily chores, listening for the subtle creaks and groans that might betray the return of their husbands. Children learned early to navigate the uncertainty, their games subdued by the invisible presence of fear. Neighbors were both observers and participants in the collective unease. Some ventured near the mine, lanterns in hand, to catch a glimpse of any sign of activity or anomaly. They reported shadows that seemed to shift with intention, lights that flickered against walls where no man stood, and faint, unintelligible whispers echoing from the depths. These accounts, repeated and slightly altered with each retelling, became a local language of dread. Even those who had never set foot in the tunnels felt the weight of the mystery pressing on daily life. Empty chairs at meals, unfinished chores, and a pervasive quiet that seemed to thicken the air. Local authorities attempted to provide structure and reassurance, though their understanding was limited by the tools and knowledge of the time. Miners' supervisors organized systematic searches, mapping the tunnels, reinforcing supports, and instructing workers on safety protocols. Yet each effort only highlighted the limitations of human perception. Lanterns disappeared or were found in unexpected places. Tracks seemed to vanish mid-step. Noises echoed without origin. Officials could provide rules and procedures, but they could not account for the experiences that were simultaneously physical and psychological, real and elusive. Doctors and early psychologists of the region were called upon to interpret the phenomena, offering theories rooted in fatigue, disorientation, and stress-induced hallucination. Observers noted that miners spent extended periods in near-total darkness, working under conditions of poor ventilation and high physical exertion. Combined with isolation and constant awareness of risk, these factors could create acute psychological strain. Physicians suggested that exhaustion and hypoxia could produce auditory and visual distortions, explaining in part the whispers, flickering lights, and perceived movement. Families were reassured by these explanations. Yet the persistence and consistency of unexplained disappearances left many unconvinced. Clergy became involved not only in spiritual counsel, but in mediating communal interpretation. Pastors visited homes, held services for the anxious, and encouraged prayer and moral reflection. They emphasized endurance, faith, and acceptance of the unknown as part of God's design. For some families, these interventions provided solace. For others, the mystery of the vanished miners became intertwined with questions of divine will, morality, and human vulnerability. Sermons invoked cautionary themes, urging miners and townsfolk to respect both the physical dangers of the mountain and the moral uncertainties of life itself. Newspapers amplified both fear and fascination. Local presses reported the disappearances in detail, highlighting the mysterious circumstances, the frantic search parties, and the growing number of witnesses who claimed to hear or see things that defied explanation. Headlines were measured but evocative, designed to draw attention while avoiding outright sensationalism. Articles mixed factual reporting with interviews of families, miners, and visiting investigators, creating a layered narrative that blurred the line between event and interpretation. Readers were left to consider not just what had occurred, but the meaning of the occurrences, the psychological, cultural, and even metaphysical implications. Social gatherings became forums for discussion and speculation. At general stores, saloons, and community halls, townsfolk debated what the disappearances meant. Some insisted on natural explanations, cave-ins, rogue gas pockets, or miscommunication. Others suggested darker possibilities, spirits guarding mineral wealth, curses upon the land, or psychological contagion affecting those who spent too long underground. Stories grew in detail and imagination, with each telling blending observation, folklore, and personal interpretation into a collective narrative. This communal storytelling became a coping mechanism, a way to process uncertainty and fear in an environment that offered few certainties. Families, meanwhile, adapted to the prolonged ambiguity. Households maintained routines with an underlying awareness of the absence, creating a tense equilibrium between hope and resignation. Meals were prepared for missing men as if they might return. Beds were left unmade in anticipation of an unexpected arrival. Children learned to respect the quiet, to notice the subtlest changes in shadows and sound. The domestic sphere became an extension of the mind itself, a psychological echo of the tension and uncertainty below. Some observers noted behavioral changes in those who had witnessed or narrowly avoided incidents. Miners who returned from deeper shafts exhibited heightened vigilance, irritability, or periods of silent withdrawal. They spoke sparingly of what they experienced, sometimes in fragmented statements that suggested time dislocation, disorientation, or acute stress responses. Psychologists of the era, observing these patterns, suggested that prolonged exposure to extreme darkness, repetitive labor, and perceived danger could produce both physical and mental strain, explaining some anomalies in perception, memory, and response. However, even contemporary analysis could not account for all facets of the disappearances. Community leaders attempted to impose order, organizing rotation schedules, group supervision, and stricter adherence to safety protocols. These measures were partially effective but never sufficient to eliminate anxiety. Each day, miners entered the tunnels with the understanding that something was amiss, yet they could not articulate or predict the force they confronted. The collective tension became a defining feature of the social environment, as much a part of daily life as wage labor, domestic responsibilities, or seasonal rhythms. In parallel, folklore and superstition reinforced communal interpretation. Elders told stories of restless spirits, ancestral guardians of mineral veins, and invisible forces that tested courage and morality. These narratives were sometimes invoked to explain the unexplainable, providing a moral or spiritual framework in which the disappearances made sense. For others, the stories intensified fear, framing ordinary hazards as manifestations of active, sentient danger. Children were warned not to venture near the mine alone. Adults hesitated before entering shafts without accompaniment. The social fabric of the town became interwoven with caution, legend, and psychological tension. In sum, the community's reaction was multifaceted, blending practical concern, psychological strain, spiritual reflection, and narrative construction. Families endured emotional hardship, neighbors bore witness to unsettling phenomena, and professionals attempted to apply scientific reasoning to extraordinary circumstances. Each layer of response, the domestic, communal, spiritual, and analytical, interacted with the others, producing a dense web of perception, interpretation, and speculation. The miner's absence became not only a mystery of physical space, but a lens through which to explore human resilience, fear, and the cultural means by which communities process events that defy ordinary understanding. Ultimately, the reaction of society to the vanished miners exemplifies the interplay between environment, culture, and psychology. It highlights how tightly interconnected communities interpret danger, manage uncertainty, and construct meaning in the face of events that elude rational explanation. The missing men were not simply absent. Their absence reshaped the social, emotional, and moral landscape of the region, leaving a legacy of tension, reflection, and the enduring question of what truly occurred in the dark Montana tunnels. The days of tension reached their apex on a cold autumn evening when a storm rolled over the mountains, turning the sky an oppressive shade of gray and sending gusts of wind through the valleys like mournful sighs. Lanterns swayed in the mine's entrances, casting long, jittering shadows across the rocky ground. The miners had completed their routine inspection and descended into the tunnels, unaware that this day would mark the culmination of the unrelenting series of mysterious disappearances that had plagued the operation. Inside the shafts, the atmosphere was dense with anticipation and dread. Dust hung in the air, illuminated by the faint orange glow of lanterns settling over timber supports and scattered tools. Every sound, drip of water, groan of wood, scuff of boots, was amplified, creating a symphony of minor disturbances that heightened awareness to a near-painful degree. Miners moved deliberately, communicating through careful taps and murmured instructions, their shadows stretching unnaturally along walls that seemed to curve and shift with every step. Then it began. A subtle vibration traveled through the rock, initially imperceptible, like the faint pulse of the mountain itself. Lanterns flickered, shadows lengthened in impossible directions. One miner paused, ears straining as a distant whisper seemed to call his name from an adjacent shaft. He responded cautiously, only for the voice to echo back immediately, altered, distorted, and impossible to locate. A sense of disorientation overtook the group. Paths they had known for years now appeared unfamiliar, angles and corners misaligned in the dim light. Panic, barely suppressed, began to ripple through the team. Suddenly, a minor collapse occurred. A timber support splintered under unseen pressure, sending fragments of wood and rock into the air. Miners ducked instinctively, some falling into shallow crevices, others grasping walls as dust clouded the tunnel. When the debris settled, one miner was missing. Another called out frantically, voice cracking, but the reply came from a location inconsistent with the man's last known position. It was a sound at once familiar and alien, a dissonance that sent a shiver through the others. The mine, once a structured workspace, had become a labyrinth of threat, distortion, and psychological pressure. As the group pressed deeper into the tunnels, lights flickered unpredictably. Shadows writhed along the walls, forming shapes suggestive of figures moving just out of reach. Another miner vanished mid-step, leaving behind only the faint imprint of boots and dust. Lanterns that had been held steadily now swung wildly, casting light that caught the shimmer of moisture on rock and created illusions of movement where none existed. The men shouted, calling names, but the responses seemed to come from impossible directions, echoing from behind walls, from the ceiling, from the floor. Anxiety surged. Rational explanation dissolved in the intensity of perception. In one particularly harrowing moment, a small group encountered a fissure they had never noticed before. A crack in the mountain wide enough to peer into, but seemingly endless in depth. From within emanated a low, resonant hum, vibrating through the chest and bones. One miner, compelled by both fear and curiosity, leaned over the edge, and the sound seemed to respond, rising in pitch as though acknowledging his presence. His companions shouted warnings, but before he could retreat, he disappeared into the darkness, leaving nothing behind except the swaying lanterns and the echo of his scream, carried and distorted by the stone. The remaining miners struggled to regroup. Every corridor and junction seemed altered. Familiar markers, scars on timber, chalk marks, equipment placement, no longer corresponded to memory. It was as though the mountain itself had reshaped its interior. Voices called from all directions, some recognizable, some hauntingly strange, producing auditory illusions that made movement treacherous. Attempts to retrace their steps failed. Corridors looped unpredictably, and every attempt to illuminate the surroundings intensified disorientation. The air felt thicker, each breath a conscious effort as fear sharpened senses and dulled judgment simultaneously. Time became nearly meaningless. Minutes stretched into hours. The miners' perceptions fractured under the stress. A sudden drop of loose rock startled one man who tumbled and fell into an unseen pit. He clung to a jagged ledge, lantern swinging, heart racing, and heard faint laughter, or was it a whisper, emanating from above. When he looked, nothing moved. His companions tried to reach him, but the tunnels no longer appeared as they had known, corridors folding, walls shifting, space betraying expectation. The physical danger merged seamlessly with the psychological, creating an environment where the unseen and unknown dictated every action. Outside, storms pounded the mountain, gusts lashing against cabins and trees. Families listened anxiously, knowing the men were inside yet powerless to intervene. Lightning flashed intermittently, illuminating the mine entrance for a brief moment, revealing shadows that seemed disproportionate, elongated, and distorted. Thunder rolled, echoing through the valleys, amplifying the sense that the earth itself was alive and complicit in the events unfolding underground. Concerned townsfolk attempted to organize additional search parties, but access was limited, and every report returned with more questions than answers. The final series of vanishings occurred almost simultaneously, as if the mine had reached a crescendo of its own design. Lanterns went dark inexplicably, tools shifted in impossible ways, and men vanished where none had space to disappear. The remaining miners were left disoriented, speaking in fragmented sentences, navigating by memory and instinct alone. Fatigue, terror, and disorientation converged into a state of extreme vulnerability. The darkness pressed in on all sides, alive with both physical hazards and intangible menace. Every sound, every shadow, every flicker of light became a potential threat, and the boundary between reality and hallucination blurred irrevocably. By the end of the night, those who survived emerged into the storm-lashed air, some hours or even a day later, unsure of how long they had been underground. Their faces were pale, eyes wide with the residual fear of experiences almost impossible to articulate. Many refused to speak immediately, communicating instead through gestures or simple nods. Those who listened carefully noted that accounts of what occurred were inconsistent in detail, but consistent in effect. A pervasive disorientation, the sense of malevolent awareness in the shadows, and the terrifying realization that the mine had asserted control over perception and action. The climax of the miners' saga left both participants and witnesses in a state of suspended disbelief. Authorities documented what could be observed: the absence of men, the physical condition of the tunnels, displaced equipment, but none could fully account for the psychological impact. the eerie auditory phenomena, or the spatial distortions reported by survivors. Families continued to search in vain for missing members, townsfolk debated explanations, and the mine, unperturbed, remained a dark, silent sentinel over the events that had transpired. Even today, the recollection of that night persists as a touchstone of horror, psychological tension, and unexplained phenomena. The mountain and its labyrinthine tunnels, unchanging and indifferent, hold the memory of vanished men, the echoes of their voices, and the residual anxiety of those who witnessed the incomprehensible. The climax was not merely a series of physical events, but a demonstration of human vulnerability, environmental unpredictability, and the power of fear to reshape perception. It stands as the point at which ordinary labor transformed into extraordinary terror, where the known world collapsed into uncertainty, leaving an indelible mark on the community and the historical record. Long after the last lantern had swung in the tunnels and the storm had passed, the mountain retained its silence. Families who had waited, prayed, and feared for days found themselves confronting the profound emptiness of absence. Chairs remained unoccupied at tables. Boots and hats left near the cabin doors were slowly covered in dust and snow, and yet the faint echo of their loved ones' voices lingered in memory, haunting corridors of thought that no rational explanation could dispel. The miners who returned were forever altered. Those who vanished left behind a vacuum that no investigation could fill. The mine itself became a locus of legend. Locals spoke in hushed tones about the dark that watches, a phrase that carried both reverence and dread. Children grew up hearing stories of men who had entered the depths and never returned, their disappearances presented as both warning and cautionary tale. Miners returning to the shafts did so with ritualized care, aware that the mountain held more than rock and ore. It contained uncertainty, a force that seemed to manipulate perception, disorient movement, and challenge the boundaries of human endurance. Lanterns flickered more quickly, ropes were double-checked, and trust among men became both a necessity and a fragile construct, dependent on shared experience and an unspoken acknowledgement of danger beyond the physical. Families, while attempting to continue with life, were enveloped by a subtle, lingering anxiety. Meals were prepared for the absent. Blankets were left folded as if awaiting the return of the missing, and conversations often turned to cautious speculation, avoiding direct mention of the events. Rumors circulated, sometimes attributing the vanishings to natural causes like gas pockets, cave-ins, or disorientation, and sometimes to more spectral interpretations, spirits, curses, or the mountain itself asserting its dominion. This blending of the rational and the supernatural shaped the collective memory of the event, leaving a community suspended between empirical understanding and instinctual fear. The psychological impact was profound. Those who returned from the tunnels reported persistent sensations, glimpses of movement in the corner of the eye, whispered words echoing in empty rooms, and the acute awareness that the dark contained more than mere absence. Sleep was shallow. The mind could not fully rest from the memory of disorientation, the inexplicable motion of shadows, and the fleeting auditory illusions that had accompanied the climax. Some experienced nightmares so vivid they recounted them with trembling voice, further perpetuating the communal narrative of an almost sentient darkness. Newspaper reports and official records chronicled the events with varying degrees of skepticism and sensationalism. Editors documented the factual components: men missing, equipment displaced, tunnels disrupted, but were limited by the constraints of observation and the inconsistency of eyewitness testimony. Scientific perspectives at the time suggested fatigue, hypoxia, or disorientation as partial explanations. Yet these could not account for the persistent anomalies. Objects moved without cause. Auditory illusions were reported consistently, and the spatial distortions experienced by miners remained unmeasurable. The mystery, therefore, transcended conventional reasoning, embedding itself in local lore as both historical fact and allegory of human vulnerability. Communities adapted, creating new practices to accommodate the lingering uncertainty. Miners entered the shafts in pairs or groups, carrying additional lighting and safety equipment. Rituals developed, specific taps or calls to reassure each other of presence, markings left on walls as navigational anchors, and standardized times for emergence to maintain accountability. Families, though anxious, participated indirectly, ensuring that safety protocols were observed and the memory of those lost remained present in communal consciousness. The mine's reputation as a site of disappearance shaped regional culture, blending cautionary wisdom with legend. Speculation regarding the vanished men persists even today. Were they victims of natural misfortune, lost within the labyrinthine passages? Or did some inexplicable force claim them entirely? Could extreme stress, darkness, and environmental conditions have produced collective disorientation so severe it defied recovery? Alternatively, might there have been a supernatural element, an entity or consciousness inherent to the mountain, influencing perception and action beyond human comprehension? The absence of definitive evidence has allowed these questions to endure, reinforcing the story's resonance as a mystery that resists resolution. The legacy of the miners who vanished extended beyond immediate tragedy. Generations of local residents inherited a heightened sensitivity to the tunnels in the mountain. Cultural memory integrated the events into oral histories, songs, and cautionary tales, embedding a sense of reverence for both the environment and the unseen forces it seemed to harbor. Visitors, drawn by curiosity or academic interest, reported feelings of unease, subtle auditory phenomena, or the impression of being observed, perpetuating the mine's mystique. The narrative became a lens through which human vulnerability, environmental complexity, and the limits of perception were examined and remembered. In reflection, the events at the Montana mine are more than a story of disappearance. They are an exploration of the human psyche under extreme stress, the intersection of culture and environment, and the ways in which communities interpret and preserve memory of the unexplainable. The vanished miners, whether lost to natural hazard, psychological breakdown, or something beyond comprehension, left an indelible mark. Their absence reshaped social dynamics, informed local folklore, and provided a haunting case study of the limits of human understanding. Even as decades passed, the mine stood silent, indifferent to inquiry or speculation. Lanterns no longer swung within its tunnels except when men ventured for maintenance, yet the air seemed charged with echoes of past events. The mountain remained both a physical obstacle and a repository of uncertainty, a place where history, human endeavor, and inexplicable phenomena intersected. In this silence, the story of the vanished miners persists, a dark chapter of human experience, a cautionary tale, and a lingering question about what lies beyond the reach of reason. The epilogue leaves a final reflection. The mine and the vanished miners challenge us to consider the boundary between human perception and the unknown. They remind us that even in a world of measurable hazards and empirical understanding, there exists a space where reality and uncertainty converge, where shadows conceal more than they reveal, and where the passage of time does not erase the memory of those who entered the dark and never returned. In Montana, the mountain keeps its secrets, and the silence that follows the vanished remains a voice of enduring mystery.